Good morning. I'm John Fortier, the American Enterprise Institute. I'm here with my colleague, Norm Ornstein, also with AEI. And I'll do a very quick introduction of Norm. He deserves a longer one, but Norm is, of course, a scholar of Congress, of institutions broadly, of elections. But in particular, the reason we're here today on the 20th or near the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is that Norm really did start to think very seriously about questions of the continuity of government on that terrible day of 9/11 and ended up certainly writing about it. And the two of us working with Tom Mann and others on this, and ultimately putting together a continuity of government commission, which was active after 9/11 and is reactivated now to look at some issues of continuity of government going forward. So that will have to serve as an introduction for more work that Norm has done. But I do want to start with Norm on this topic. And again, it's hard to believe that we're 20 years removed from what was in Washington that day, a very clear, beautiful day where horrific events happened. And Norm, maybe you could begin by just telling the story of where you were, what happened, and how that got you to start to think not just about the horrors of 9/11, but in particular, the problem of an attack on our institutions so that those institutions might not work in the time of crisis, so that Congress, the president, and other institutions would stop functioning, and what to do about it. So where were you on 9/11, and how did your thinking begin on that?
Thanks, John. And of course, 20 years later, as with some other events like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it's crystal clear in my mind about where I was and what I was doing, in this case with even more relevance 20 years ago. I was headed to Dulles Airport that morning, and it was, as you said, a beautiful, clear day, as nice a day as I can remember. And I got to the airport and went to check in, and at that point, the first plane had hit the World Trade Center. There was a lot of buzz at the airport, but most people thought it was a small plane that had gone astray. And by the time I got to the gate, started to board my plane, I was on the jetway when they called us back because, of course, the second plane had hit the World Trade Center and it was clear that this was not an accident. So I went down and retrieved my car, started to drive back downtown. I called our colleague, Carlin Bowman, who said, don't go to the office. Our office at that point, barely 6 blocks from the White House. And I went home and did as many millions of others did, glued to the television set to try and figure out what was happening and how it was happening. And of course, we then saw the plane hit the Pentagon and mayhem. By the middle of the afternoon, when we saw that United 93 had crashed in the fields in Pennsylvania, and we know why, that plane had left Newark 45 minutes late, and the passengers on board, some of them had been able to connect with family, and others learned that this was not a standard hijacking where you just sit there quietly and hope that they'll land and they'll negotiate something, but a suicide mission, and took those matters into their own hands. And as I sat there and watched that, what became clear to me in my own mind was that plane was likely headed for the Capitol, the symbol of American democracy, and the Capitol dome, cast iron. And I knew that Congress, probably around 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, which is when the other plane hit the Pentagon, would have been in morning business. And at that point, a very open place, none of the barriers. We would have had hundreds of members either inside doing some business, outside on the lawn, either doing press conferences or with groups of constituents. And a plane fully loaded with jet fuel hitting that cast iron dome would have left hundreds of members dead or missing or completely incapacitated. And it suddenly occurred to me just that afternoon, well, what happens if more than half the members of Congress are dead or missing or incapacitated? And the answer, as I knew, was there's a constitutional requirement for a quorum to do any official business of half the members. And we could have been in a situation where at the worst possible time on war footing, we would have had to rely on the equivalent of martial law, executive actions with no check and balance. So I decided that there must be some provision to deal with this. And as I looked into it over the next few days, it became clear we had no plan. Now, I wrote something. I did a regular column at that point in Roll Call, the newspaper at Capitol Hill, about this. And it turned out that there was a kindred spirit out there. Brian Baird, a congressman from the state of Washington, who had been caught up in the mayhem. And of course, members of Congress who were around at that time didn't know what to do. Nobody told them, go to some safe location or leave the Capitol grounds. Everybody was kind of scurrying around trying to figure it out. And Brian realized at the same time that this couldn't possibly be the case, that there was no plan for dealing with a catastrophe of this sort. He got in touch with me, and we started to think about what we could do to try and alter the equation and build in plans. Some additional writing, some attempts to talk to leaders and members of Congress. And then Lloyd Cutler, the former White House counsel to two presidents, got in touch and said, we need to do something more. And that was the genesis of the original Commission on the Continuity of Government. We brought in our longtime friend and colleague, Tom Mann, and the Brookings Institution as co-sponsors. We got some support. John, of course, was the executive director of the commission. We had a blue ribbon panel co-chaired by Lloyd and Alan Simpson, the former senator, Republican senator from Wyoming, with cabinet members, former members of Congress, scholars, and a number of others. And we began to do the work that resulted in 3 separate reports on the Congress, the presidency, and the courts to try and come up with insurance plans in the event of not just a terrorist attack, or at least a terrorist attack of the sort that we saw. Because there's one other factor here that we should mention right at the beginning, John, which is within days after this, we had these anthrax attacks, not all on Congress. Some went to news organizations. They were serious. People died. A couple of people at least died. But we know that some were aimed at the Senate and at Senate leaders. Envelopes sent to Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader in the Senate, for example. And what also became clear to us was that if there had been a really serious anthrax attack, gotten into the ventilation system in the Senate, we could have had 60 senators in intensive care units with inhalation anthrax and no ability to operate in the Senate. So we realized that there were other events besides the kind of attack that the terrorists brought upon the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and could have hit the Capitol that could have made a real difference. And some of them could have been natural events as well. So we can talk more about the genesis of our reports, the substance of our reports, and of course, we'll get to the fact that 20 years later, they remain unanswered, even in the face of additional threats that have emerged in the 20 years since.
Thank you, Norm. I don't want to interrupt that gripping narrative. I do want to put one little bit of housekeeping on the table. We're going to talk for a while, but then we're going to also entertain some questions from the audience. And you will see, scrolling across the bottom of your screen soon, here we go, that there are a couple of ways that you might submit questions. One is to email Samantha Goldstein, samantha.goldstein@aei.org. or on Twitter with the hashtag AEI continuity. So we'll be looking for those questions as we go further on. Let me say a few things. Norm laid out the drama of the day, and I think we want to talk about the substance in several areas. Our commission put out reports on Congress, on presidential succession, on the continuity of the Supreme Court, and also dealt with some issues relating to transitions and elections a bit. We also are reconstituting this commission to look at some other issues related to the pandemic. and some things that maybe we didn't see quite as clearly, thinking about a terrorist attack in the day that we're seeing today with the pandemic. But I think we should start with this problem of Congress. That's where the most obvious point was on 9/11, where the 9/11 Commission later confirmed that fourth plane was headed to the Capitol, what we suspected that day. And really, what would happen if Congress were subject to a terrible attack? Of course, it would be horrible. There would be loss of life. We would all be shocked and have it was a terrible day. But thinking about what the aftermath might have been had the attack been successful, I think is important. And Norm laid out a lot of the issues, but let's say that Congress had been hit in such a way that members of the House and Senate, many of them were dead. And then also a secondary issue, what if some of them were incapacitated, very seriously injured, unable to communicate or unable to do their jobs? If we were talking about large numbers of people in Congress, what we started to think through in the day was, could Congress operate at all? If it did operate in a kind of small way with just a few members, would that be illegitimate, unconstitutional? And what would be the answers for getting Congress back into its regular state as quickly as possible, or something close to it? First, let's remind ourselves that we often think of presidential action as important in emergencies, and we do. And I think we're going to talk about that in a second part of this conversation, because we have some things to say about presidential succession. But Congress was very active after 9/11, active in authorizing the use of force, retaliation for the attacks, for having legislation related to national security legislation, transportation security legislation, appropriation of funds, the rebuilding of New York. There are a number of things that Congress did in the days and weeks after 9/11. And if we think about even more serious scenarios, if Congress were not there, what would we have? Would we have a vacuum? Would a president just step in and rule by fiat or martial law, or some general if the president wasn't there? Wouldn't we want Congress, our representative institution, to be there in some capacity to do the things that it normally does? And here's the problem. One, Norm mentioned there is a quorum requirement in Congress. The Constitution, we think, is pretty clear about it. It says that a majority of the House or the majority of the Senate is the quorum. There's some quibbles about some interpretations and precedents from the past where there was some thought that, well, maybe that number is a little bit smaller, but for all practical purposes, it makes sense. The founders wanted to have a body where a majority of people were there. Otherwise, you might have a small group of people, 20 members showing up in some other part of the country saying we're the Congress. That had happened in English history and was something to be protected against. So the founders wanted us to have a majority of people there in the House and the Senate. And what if they were not there? What if an attack killed many of them? Here we look at two different problems. One, the Senate and the House. And on the simple issue of the death of many members, they're very different. The Senate, for the most part, most states have a provision authorized by the Constitution where their legislatures have given the governor the power to appoint a replacement until you could have a special election. And there we see that fairly regular. Someone leaves office or dies in office, and within days, a governor may appoint a replacement who will that replacement will last for some months or maybe even up to 2 years until the next election happens. But there'll be somebody in place, and so an attack where many senators died would be terrible. But the Senate would reconstitute itself. It would have most of its members back quite quickly. The House is not like that. The House has a constitutional provision that the only way to fill a vacancy is to have a special election. And those special elections take some time. They take several months, and depending on state law, might take 6 or 8 or 9 months. And there could be a period of time where there is no majority in Congress available, that 300 members are missing, and that the remainder is questioning, are we able to act? Do we have a quorum? Or even the question of, do we want a small number of House members acting as the whole House, a a group of people who might not be representative of the current Congress at all. If today's Congress had something like this happen to it and all the representatives from one state were the one to survive, or one party, is that what we want for a House of Representatives? So this is the type of problem we really tried to wrestle with. How can we deal with a Congress that has really been knocked out, that it doesn't have a majority? Can it get back quickly? There's another problem of incapacitation, and maybe I'll let Norm get into those. But let's start with this problem, Norm. How do we deal with a situation where Congress either constitutionally can't act, or functionally we feel like it wouldn't be proper for a small House of Representatives really to be acting as Congress, which might look very different than the rest of the country, the rest of the Congress?
Yeah, and to underscore a couple of the points you made, John, the quorum requirement really was an expectation that you would have a representative body there to make decisions, and that there could be many occasions where it would be unrepresentative, and that could lead to not just bad decisions, but decisions that would lack any level of legitimacy. So if you think about where we would have been if there had been no Congress in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, think about a Patriot Act that didn't have the checks and balances built in that Congress did. They were certainly criticized for being inadequate, but they were significant. Think about the fact that we had a Department of Homeland Security created in the months after this, but it was changed very substantially by Congress. Think about the fact that we wouldn't be able to appropriate money to deal with the responses that we needed after 9/11. And so for all of those reasons, including having a Congress that would pick leaders, possibly, if the leaders were no longer there, that could distort policy. And John mentioned the Senate. Also think about the fact that if you have a number of members creating a majority who are incapacitated for months on end, you have no route out, no ability even to have those special elections that after months could create a new body. Because you can't expel people, you need 2/3 of the body to do that, and you can't replace people who are still alive. So there are all of those questions that were raised and that led us, I think, to the inexorable conclusion that if we were going to have a Congress in place immediately or very soon after some disastrous event occurred, it would have to be with temporary, emergency, interim appointments for both the House and Senate until you could have real elections to create replacements for those who were no longer there, or allow time for people who are incapacitated who could recover and come back to be able to resume their seats. And that led us into a firestorm, of course, of criticism from some in Congress who didn't want to think about the possibility of their own demise, but also in the House about the fact that nobody's ever served in the body who wasn't first elected.
So let me highlight a few things that you said, and maybe say something more in detail about the kinds of recommendations that we made on this front. I'm still holding back a little bit on the incapacitation question. I think that's important. We haven't really talked about that, but let's just talk about straightforward again. Horrible attack or something causes many deaths in the House and Senate. We went along quite a way in our deliberations and our thinking and our writing about all these issues, and started to really come to the conclusion that we do need a way to replace members of Congress until we have special elections. Of course, we want those special elections to happen. We want the people to weigh in, but it's not realistic to think that people are going to be able to hold elections in a week, 2 weeks, 3-4 months, which is the time period where many important things happen in Congress. But one interesting note is that we didn't know, in doing all of this work and thinking about it, that there had been an earlier history about this. During the Cold War, these things were thought of in the context of, again, nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. What would happen if there were a catastrophic attack? And the Senate 3 times passed a constitutional amendment, which looked a lot like the one we ended up recommending. Again, I think I'm leaving aside this question of incapacitation. That's an additional problem which they did not address. But this various versions of this amendment said if there are a large number of House members who are killed or there are vacancies because of an attack, and the numbers varied from 150 to a little bit more, close to a majority, then there would be a procedure for appointment of these temporary members of Congress from each state, by the governors in this case. We have some mixed ideas about how we could appoint those, but the governors, and that those people would serve again only until the states could have those special elections and replace them more permanently. That would allow the House to function. That would allow the House to look somewhat like a representative body, that every district in the country would have some representation. And it might not be perfect, but of course the attack has destroyed that perfection, not the remedy. It amazed us in a way that we'd had this series of debates, hearings, and ultimately even passage of constitutional amendments with enormous majorities, near unanimous majorities in the Senate 3 times in the 50s and 60s, and then ultimately the House not acting in these matters. That history was forgotten. That was forgotten as the members, the senators who were introducing these bills left Congress. And it was very hard to find, other than in archival records, people who had any recollection that this had even happened, and yet they had thought the same thing. So I think that's both heartening to think that people in the similar situations were thinking the same thing, but disappointing to think that we went through the Cold War and that possibility of nuclear war with the Soviet Union and didn't deal with the issue. And we went through 9/11, this crisis moment where we saw again the problems of a Congress not being there, not being able to operate when it was most needed. And part of the story is we haven't really addressed that question in the way we should. So I'm going to maybe open up one last time for you, Norm, to say something about the kinds of recommendations that we made as a commission about dealing with that issue of death. I want to take a little time to think about the incapacitation issue, and then I also want to spend some time thinking the aftermath, and then go on to issues of presidential succession. So, do you want to say a little bit more about our recommendations and maybe some of these questions of incapacity?
Sure, and on the core recommendations, we were very sensitive to the concerns that members might have about this. We bandied about a number of options, some of which had been done by state legislatures during the Cold War. For example, having people run for Congress with a replacement figure named in case something happened, so that you'd have the greatest level of continuity. What we decided would be the best is only in the event of a catastrophe, only in the event of something that was devastating and that could challenge the very function of the institution and its representativeness, would there be a threshold where you would allow these emergency interim appointments. And the emergency interim appointments could be made by governors, or could be made with a list of people that the member himself or herself would leave of potential replacements. Could be kept private until that event occurred, so that you wouldn't have people upset that they weren't on the list, or upset that they were on the list. But the critical element of it was that there would be these emergency interim appointments. They would only last until you could have special elections. And keep in mind that in the best of times, if we have a vacancy, we've had several in this Congress. Sometimes it's people leaving, members leaving to go into the cabinet. Sometimes it's people dying. We had one representative-elect die of COVID, for example. That with instances where there are 1 or 2 or 3, they take on average 4 months, sometimes even longer, to do a replacement. And if we had hundreds of them in the fog of war, it would take much more time. So we wanted to have interim replacements there that would be gone as soon as an effective election and representative election could take place. Now, in terms of incapacitation, keep in mind that we've had this happen in individual cases before. In the House of Representatives, Gladys Noon Spellman, a representative from Maryland, had a devastating stroke and was in effect in a vegetative state and stayed that way until the end of a Congress because there was no plan for a special election as long as Representative Spellman was alive. In the Senate, a long time ago, Carl Mundt, a Republican from South Dakota, was comatose for months. And basically that seat remained with nobody able to fulfill the functions of a senator until Senator Mundt died. And remember, the Senate terms are 6 years. So it's not just a matter of waiting out a few months or a year before you can have something happen. So our idea there was that if you had somebody who was deemed incapable of serving, and with some safeguards to make sure it wasn't misused, there would be an emergency replacement until that individual could sign an affidavit saying, I'm ready to get back and to resume my post. All of this, it should be said, would have to be done by constitutional amendment. And we proposed a constitutional amendment. And one thing I want to add here, John, is that we had some very strong and important advocates inside Congress. And that includes a couple of senators, John Cornyn of Texas, who chaired the Constitution Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and his counterpart, Russ Feingold, who was the ranking member. And Senator Feingold had previously said that he would oppose all constitutional amendments out of a belief that once you supported some, it was a slippery slope and it would make it too easy to amend the Constitution, but understood the gravity of this. And they co-sponsored a constitutional amendment that got reported out of the subcommittee, but got no further. So there were people inside Congress who understood the gravity of the problem and wanted to move with us to a common sense solution, difficult as it would be to do a constitutional amendment. But as we will discover or in our conversation, there were others who were so avidly opposed that they kept any of the action from getting any further.
And yeah, let me add a couple points. First, on the question of incapacitation, just to underscore what Norm said, we do have cases, and we have had cases in our history of members who, for a time or sometimes even a longer period of time, really have not been able to function. And there really has been no way to remove those people while they were in office. The case of Gladys Noon Spellman, which Norm mentioned, and also a parallel, also sad case of Hale Boggs, the leader in the House, who was up campaigning with another member, Nick Begich, the father of later Senator Mark Begich, in Alaska, was lost in a plane crash before the election. Never found, presumed dead. But we are, with both that case and the Spellman case, we got those people were elected as missing, or in the case of Spellman, in a coma, but then ultimately were not able to show up for the next Congress. And then their seats were declared vacant. What we've never done, and we don't think there's really constitutional ability to do that, is just to say someone's incapacitated, therefore the seat is vacant. And there'd be all sorts of problems with that, both abuses and what if the member recovered. Norm mentioned perhaps the body could expel members. That takes 2/3. They might not be there. It's also very controversial. There's no good way of dealing with that issue. And so we, again, like the vacancy issue, did not want to deal with that for everyday cases. We understand that this may happen to 1, 2, 3, or 4 members at a time. And that's unfortunate that might have a lack of representation from that state. But in the case of a mass situation with many, many people who are really unable to function or are dead, that's a different case where we thought a trigger would be set to allow things to happen. On the question of what to do about it, again, Norm mentioned some people who are helpful. I also mentioned an early effort with Representatives Martin Frost and Chris Cox, Republican and Democrat, who also were very receptive to lots of these issues. That at some point, after much consideration, didn't last. And I guess I would say that the issue became a little political, but I also think there was some sense of members of Congress that, boy, it's too hard to pass a constitutional amendment, or perhaps we don't want to think about these issues too seriously because it's like contemplating your own demise. And there were some solutions, and I almost want to put these in scare quotes, that were introduced and some of them put into place, which we think really were inadequate. They were meant to deal with the problem, but they didn't go that far and even caused some harm. They were two. One was some people thought, well, maybe we could have these special elections very quickly. And there was some thought in early days that maybe in 20 days you could have elections all around the country, and that was scaled back a little bit, and ultimately something passed to say, high 40s, 49 days. We think that's very impractical, knowing how elections work, knowing how election administrators felt about it, thinking about the country in crisis, even thinking about some of our procedures, like we have to mail absentee ballots or mail ballots out to overseas voters at least 45 days before an election. There is no way to have snap special elections. We don't want to have snap special elections where the members are then elected that really have no campaign, and maybe we don't know who they are. There's no scrutiny. So we think that's not helpful. And then the second part that I think Congress really should rethink, it was an attempt to show that Congress could operate after an attack. There is a rule that was put in the days Republicans were in the majority, but has been kept in by Democrats and Republican majorities since then in the House, that essentially says if something terrible happens, we're going to slowly over time call to see who's around, and then ultimately redefine the quorum down to a very small number, essentially to whoever can stand up and say, I'm here and I'm available. That's the Congress of the United States. And the reason we think that is really not a solution, in fact, is worse than the problem itself in many ways, is that what if you had 30 members of Congress left as the House of Representatives left as the remaining members? And those 30 members could be from one state, from one part of the country, of one party, or broadly would be very unrepresentative of America. And those people would be there as the House of Representatives to help pass laws, to elect a speaker who could be in the line of succession, might end up becoming president, and doing all sorts of other things. And we think that the real issue is to get people back into the seats so they can vote and so we can have a representative Congress, not that we can say Congress can just limp along with just a few people there, which ultimately could be very dangerous. So Norm, I will turn to you, and I mean, if you have last thoughts about the aftermath and what was done, we also are bringing an effort together to think about what could be done, not only on the issues that haven't been addressed, but also on pandemic issues. And then I'd like to turn to this second set of issues, which is related, but this question of presidents and presidential succession and the various issues, including presidential succession issues during the election and transition period, and a number of thorny issues that we dealt in our second report. So do you have last words to say about where we stand on the continuity of Congress issue 20 years after 9/11?
Sure. And I think a few observations. One is our difficulties getting the attention of Congress and getting action on this were very much bipartisan difficulties. The initial problems that we had in moving along, and we had some hearings, we had certainly a number of members who got very much engaged. I mentioned the two in the Senate. But the leaders, as the Republicans had Congress at that time, really did not have any interest in moving forward with this. And when we had subsequent periods where there were Democrats in charge, we got the same reaction. Now, I think if we put this into even broader historical context, John mentioned the Cold War, but we could go back further in history, and as we'll turn to presidential succession, we had many periods of time where there was nobody effectively in the line of succession for the presidency. We could have had a dramatic crisis. and it took at least 2 assassinations to push action. When Congress is acting and they're dealing with an issue that is of immediate concern, they can mobilize. If they don't mobilize at that point, the likelihood that they're going to for something that becomes more theoretical, when there's always the reason to put it aside because there's something more immediate, that becomes an endemic kind of issue. So for all of those reasons, the fact that, as John said, people don't want to consider their own demise. All of us probably know people who should have wills, but who've decided that they're superstitious and they don't want to do it, or it will raise difficult issues within the family. And so they don't do something that is particularly relevant and important for them, hoping that nothing bad will occur along the way. Now, what we've seen in the time since we first grappled with these issues is this additional set of problems that can occur that the pandemic itself has really highlighted. Now, before I get to that directly, I want to say that we had a hearing in the House Administration Committee back in the day where one of the people who testified was the representative from Rhode Island, Jim Langevin, who said we need to have the ability to have a remote Congress, and that we could be in a situation, which of course was there in the aftermath of 9/11 potentially, where there's no air traffic allowed for a long period of time, where members are back in, not in Washington, but perhaps back in their home districts or states and can't get back. And what are we going to do under those circumstances? And frankly, nobody paid much attention to that at the time because we didn't think that that was as relevant a set of issues to deal with. What the pandemic showed, when we did have the strong possibility that members would not be able to get back to Washington and that we wouldn't have that physical gathering, which is needed. One of the few things done in the aftermath of 9/11 was that we at least set up an alternative site for Congress to meet if the Capitol itself had been destroyed, Fort McNair, near, not that far away from the Capitol site itself. But if people can't get back, you have no Congress. And the pandemic showed us that we needed to think and grapple seriously with the possibility that we might not have the physical ability to meet. And of course, the technology has changed enough now that there are many possibilities securely to be able to meet remotely. And we can talk a little bit more about all of the Sturm und Drang that surrounded the idea of allowing remote voting, much less remote hearings and remote debate. But the pandemic raised those issues, and also the possibility, again, of very substantial numbers of members who potentially could catch a virus and be on ventilators and unable to serve for periods of time. Incapacitation taken to a different level that we briefly considered with anthrax, but that becomes significantly more relevant as we have these new deadly viruses that emerge. And viruses that can emerge along with other possibilities that can take place that mean that terrorist attacks could take on a different venue and coloration than simply having explosives set off or planes directed to hit physical sites.
Yes, and I'm going to transition to presidential succession, but I would add a couple of points. Yes, these issues of Congress in a pandemic are on our plate to think about going further. And briefly thinking about it, we've obviously had debates. In some ways, it's become political already. The Senate might have different answers. That they didn't make this move. The House did move to a form of proxy voting. Some think that was a good idea. Some think that we should actually have much more remote voting, and some think that we shouldn't do that. We should use the powers of Congress as they are. So we're going to try to wrestle with those issues. But I think the important thing is, in all of these cases, in the earlier cases, we want Congress to be in place to function after an attack. And we also want Congress to be able to function in the case where it might be hard for everybody to come together. And let's figure out a way in which we might find some solutions that we can have in place for the next emergency, the next attack, where those things can be done, where Congress will be able to be there as an institution after a terrible incident. So let me move to the second big topic, and that is
John,
yes.
I think it's worth noting here before we move on that the House did grapple seriously with the remote voting issue because of the pandemic, and of course, ultimately moved to a somewhat jerry-rigged system of having a proxy voting process take place. It continues to be in place. There was actually some question as you move from one house to the next where you don't have rules, what happens if members couldn't get back to Washington, but the provisions are there. They're continuing to grapple with them because you're not supposed to be able to use a proxy voting system unless you have a health reason for doing so. One of the reasons that there was reluctance to move here was a fear that people would say, hey, why do I even have to be in Washington at all? And you would lose what the framers had in mind, the face-to-face gathering of members to debate, something that we wanted to have obviated only in the event of a great catastrophe. And we've now seen a number of members who've taken off to do other things like going down to the border, which had nothing to do with being sidelined by COVID and then using proxy voting. But they've kept that process in place. The Senate did nothing on this front. And it continues to have the vulnerability there that if senators can't get back to Washington, or if many are incapacitated, they have no ability to vote remotely. So we could be in a situation yet again with a virus or something else where there's no Congress. We continue to have issues with members and leaders willing to take tough steps to grapple with these issues.
So let me do a little bit of housekeeping before moving on to the next topic to remind you, we already have some questions coming in. We're going to take some time to hear from you. And then you can do that by emailing Samantha Goldstein, that's samantha.goldstein@aei.org with your question, or on Twitter with the hashtag AEI continuity. Let's try to grapple with this big topic of presidential succession. And I say it's a big topic because the most obvious thing that people think about is, well, when a president dies, the vice president takes over. And if the vice president were to die, there's a line of succession. There's a law that has a whole list of other people who take over. And that's true. But I think when we got into this thinking about especially a mass attack, a 9/11 style attack, where perhaps the president and the line of succession was also implicated, think about the inauguration, think about a State of the Union, think about even the week before 9/11 when there was a joint session of Congress where the Mexican president Vicente Fox spoke before both houses. Sometimes members of the administration are there as well. You could imagine the possibility of not just a simple case of a president dying or vice president dying and the next person in line steps up, but all sorts of other problems of continuity. I'll get into other issues too, because again, the easy thing to think about is the death of a president, but there are also the cases of a president being incapacitated. We've heard a bit about the 25th Amendment, maybe not so helpfully in the last few years, but we've heard about that. We know about the possibility of a president being impeached and removed, or resigning from office. So there are other scenarios that would lead to the vacancy of a president. One other very difficult one is that an election is not resolved. We don't know the winner of the election. Maybe the presidency is vacant there. So there are all sorts of issues. I guess to put on the table just some of the biggest ones, the Constitution is pretty silent about most of these matters. It says the vice president will take over. We have later on the 25th Amendment, which we can get into which has helpful details on incapacitation, but not every answer. But it also gives Congress the power to write a law that tells you many more of the details. And that's where this line of succession that many school children know that today stands in the law, the Speaker of the House, the President pro tem, and the Senate, and then the cabinet in order of the dates that cabinet was created. we started thinking about this and realized, there are some major problems related to an attack that just stand out. One is that everybody in this line is in Washington, D.C. And yes, the Secret Service tries to keep track of where people are, but to say that they aren't somewhat near each other, or perhaps a nuclear attack or something that was very devastating might not knock out the entire line of succession, that is a possibility. It's also a question of, should those congressional leaders be in a line of succession, the speaker and the president pro tem? Just a little bit of our history. We've had different laws. At times we've had Congress in, at times we've had just the cabinet. And some of the advantage, both, I think constitutionally, many people think that cabinet succession is more proper, that James Madison believed that, and many people today, but also just structurally thinking about that someone from the same administration, the same party would step in. If there were incapacitation issues, they could step in and step back, where members of the House of Representatives and the Senate could not. So we thought about those issues. We thought about, what about the people in the line of succession? Does it make sense to have this line that's just in the order the cabinet departments were created? Homeland Security was created later. Interior was created pretty early. It's pretty high up in the line of succession. What should the order be? And so these are the types of questions we thought, as well as many other things. If a terrible attack happened, and I'll get to some of the worst cases like the inauguration, but even a terrible attack happened in a mass way, our line of succession deals with a single death very well, but it doesn't deal very well with the possibility of mass deaths and trying to find a new president in a case of chaos.
So it's interesting to look even at a little bit of the historical background on presidential succession. It's been changed a number of times since the beginning. I'm not going to spend time, because we do have some questions going over all of it, just to say that the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 was put in place because Harry Truman, having gone to Potsdam in the aftermath of the Second World War with his Secretary of State, Stettinius, felt there were real vulnerabilities there, and that the line of succession at that point, which did not have members of Congress, which did not go very deeply, needed change, and managed to convince Congress to pass a new Presidential Succession Act. It was time, even without 9/11, to reconsider some of the elements of that act, which has very significant problems and gaps. One of the biggest ones is that, as Truman insisted on putting members of Congress back in the line, in the early days, you had only the two members of Congress, but the first in line after the vice president was the president pro tempore of the Senate, followed by the Speaker of the House. He wanted to flip those around because he thought the Speaker was more representative of the country, and that members of Congress, having been elected, would be more representative. But he also wanted to take into account what would happen if one of those figures was unavailable for a short period of time, perhaps traveling and unable to be reached. So he left open the possibility that the Speaker of the House, who would be next in line after the president and vice president, would be able to assume the post even after somebody else had taken it temporarily. Now think about what that might mean, which could be that the Speaker of the House, who under the law would have to resign from the post of Speaker to take the position, decided not to assume the presidency and let somebody else, whether the president pro tempore or the cabinet in the order of the line of succession, to take over. But the Speaker would then tell that person who was acting as president, "You're going to do what I tell you," or at any subsequent time, I can say, "Sorry, you're out and I'm in." That's not really the way you want things to operate. And you don't want to have everybody in the line of succession being in Washington. John mentioned the State of the Union. And of course, now they try and deal with that by having the designated survivor, which has been celebrated in the last few years on television. But the nightmare scenario really is the inauguration, where you could have a fog of war, everybody in the line gone, and no ability to decide who takes over. We have one additional issue that we will raise in a few minutes, which was unresolved by the 25th Amendment, that, of course, created an opportunity at least to have a vice presidential succession if there were a vacancy in that office, but left open what would happen if both the president and vice president were incapacitated at the same time, something that could easily have happened in the age of COVID. There are many issues that we have to grapple with here. As we did so, looking at the presidential succession process, we grappled first with the issue of whether having members of Congress in the line of succession was constitutional or appropriate. And there are real questions about the constitutionality. The Congress says that Congress, after a vice president, can create a line of succession from among officers of the United States. That's with a capital O in the Constitution. That means an executive branch official, not necessarily a member of Congress. But then there are, of course, the additional questions. One is whether it's appropriate, if a president and vice president are no longer there, for, say, a speaker from the other party to assume the presidency, which goes against what voters had chosen. The other is the conflicts of interest involved. If you have a president impeached, and then you have a Senate that has to convict. And of course, we know that that particular possibility was a reality when Andrew Johnson was impeached and not removed from office by one vote, but the president pro tempore of the Senate at that point would have been the successor. So we grappled with that, and also with another reality, which is cabinet members are chosen not because they are appropriately trained and have the experience to move directly into the presidency if need be, often for regional considerations or for balance of different types. And you might have a Secretary of Agriculture, for example, who is extremely well versed in issues of agriculture, but not really somebody you would necessarily want to move immediately into the presidency and deal with international issues or other kinds of problems. So we thought what made sense was to leave the top cabinet officials in place, State, Treasury, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, maybe Homeland Security, but then have a series of others who would be nominated by the president, would have to be confirmed in the same way that under the 25th Amendment, a vice presidential successor is put in place. And that in the interim, having been nominated, and that could be from the widest range of people, including former presidents and vice presidents, people with depth and breadth to be president, but they would then also be designated as officers of the United States, be briefed, be ready, as to use the cliche, on day one if necessary, and could be geographically diverse enough that you wouldn't have to worry about a single devastating attack on Washington, D.C.
So let me again do one last bit of house business, because we're going to have some questions. I'll give you one last chance to send your questions in. We'll have just a little bit more discussion, and then we'll turn to you. And that is, again, by emailing Samantha Goldstein, samantha.goldstein@aei.org, or on Twitter with the hashtag AEI Continuity. The last few things we'll say, and there's plenty more to be said, or maybe just raising some of the other issues related to presidential succession that we have some answers for, but I think we're going to grapple with more with the thinking of what's happened in recent years and the pandemic. One is that the question of the incapacity, we mentioned that, and we've talked about the 25th Amendment a bit, without getting to all the various issues in the 25th Amendment, just thinking about the pandemic, the issue of what if the president and the vice president are both very sick or so incapacitated that they can't operate. There, I think we don't have a really good answer to presidential succession. We have the Presidential Succession Act, which you might imagine that perhaps the Speaker of the House could come over temporarily. That's not a very practical situation. That Speaker would have to leave the House, wouldn't be able to go back, might be of another party. So that's a very difficult question that's not dealt with in the 25th Amendment. And then a second set of issues that really come after Election Day. Questions about, well, even some before Election Day, questions about candidates dying right before the election. Questions about people who've been elected already dying after the election, but before the inauguration. Questions about elections that aren't resolved. Either they're not resolved at the states, but more particularly that somehow Congress, like the case of 1876 in particular, where there was a deadlock which almost went to Inauguration Day, which was then in March, where we didn't know if we would be able to select a president. Those are cases of presidential vacancy and succession that we worry about. Who would become president if we're deadlocked? This happens. And then finally, I guess I wanted to just highlight the last day in this scenario is where I still, if what keeps me up at night is this question of what happens on the inauguration. And people think the inauguration, it's like the State of the Union, and it is in a way. There are many people together, Congress and the executive branch, but it's a particularly difficult question because we're having this transfer of power. And the transfer of power, one president is going to end his or her term at noon on January 20th, no matter what, the term ends. And a new president is going to take over. And if something terrible happened at that ceremony, of course, the new president and the old president will have to leave office anyway. The new president will be gone. There will not be a new cabinet in place appointed by the new president. There are some ways in which we might go back to the old cabinet, or even acting members who are still hanging around from the old cabinet. There's the fog of war. There's the question of the congressional leaders who might be at this session, who almost are always at the inaugural session, the Speaker and the President pro tem, who are potential successors. It is a very messy situation. We had some recommendations from the past, and I think that's right. One of them very simply being that the new incoming president could actually have some of his cabinet or her cabinet set to go, and the confirmation process, as often happens, and usually happens a few hours or maybe days later, but that some of those people might even be appointed the night before, the morning of, so they'll be in place. That doesn't solve all of the issues, but certainly this issue of the inauguration and all of the issues that lead from Election Day up to that inauguration are very tricky problems of presidential succession. And again, we would not want a terrorist attack, a pandemic, an election controversy so hamstringing our institutions, or even making it confusing as to who really leads those institutions, that would lead to some sort of crisis. And that's the sort of issue that we tried to deal with. We think the good news is that many of these issues can be dealt with by legislation, not by constitutional amendment. But again, some of these are very difficult, and people have not acted in a way as much as we think they should have after 9/11, and now with the pandemic have another opportunity to do so. Norm, do you want to say one last word, and then we'll turn to some questions?
Sure. I will say, first of all, that the courts are another area in which we thought very seriously. Because some of these issues may involve questions of the law, we want to be sure that we have a court in place that doesn't require, if there is no Supreme Court, for example, if it falls below what is a statutory quorum requirement of 6 justices, that you don't have 14 appeals courts, each popping up with different rulings that could add to the confusion. So that's an area that for another day that we can talk about. I want to mention as well that John and I, in the aftermath of 9/11 and with our commission, also began to think about the elections themselves. We have no plan in place if there is a significant disruption on Election Day. And that can happen because of natural events. We're seeing an increased intensity of storms that extend into October and November. In the midterm elections in 2018, Hurricane Michael, a Category 5, what was called a once-in-a-century event, went up the Gulf Coast and came within an eyelash just a couple of weeks before the election of devastating Pensacola, the largest city in the Panhandle. If that had happened and Pensacola had been unable to reconstitute itself and vote, critical gubernatorial and Senate elections in Florida might have been completely disrupted. And we just haven't thought through the conditions that can take place. Or if the electrical grid goes out in one part of the country, which could be caused by pernicious attacks by others or for other reasons. So there are many important issues here that people just didn't think about before because we weren't looking at the possibility of dramatic or drastic events. And those dramatic or drastic events have increased in range, breadth, and number. And that's why we have reconstituted this commission to go back over and look at whether what we did is appropriate, can be amended if need be, but also to add to what was done so that we can protect the country and our fundamentals in the event of terrible things happening.
Okay, again, we're going to turn to your questions, and you're still welcome to submit some last minute ones. Again, you see below on the screen, Samantha Goldstein at AEI.org or Twitter, AEI Continuity, the hashtag. Let's start with a tough question, which is a fair question. That is really about the support ultimately for a kind of constitutional amendment like the one we were proposing. We had a variety of things which sort of fit in our criteria, but broadly speaking, an amendment that allowed for replacement of members in the case of mass incapacitation or mass death of members. And you know, at the end of the day, that amendment didn't get a lot of votes. And I certainly think things got politicized. But you know, I think the real question is, what do we do about this? We all admit that it is a terrible problem. The people proposing solutions aren't creating the problem. The problem is caused by the attack or the pandemic or some force that is really making Congress inoperable, making Congress either not have a quorum or have a very small number of members. And we don't think that the solution is just to say, well, maybe a few members of Congress, of the House, can limp along and say they're the House. We don't think that we can speed up special elections very much. We'd like to have special elections and as quickly as reasonably possible to ultimately fill those seats. But we really do worry about this question of the vacancy here. And so, you know, I do think there is some work to be done, and people had gotten polarized on this issue. But I think the problem really stares at you. What do you do if Congress really can't operate because people are missing? And, you know, while at the end of the day in a vote on a type of amendment like this, it didn't get a lot of votes, it really is something that still screams out for solutions. And again, we had some options within that realm, but I think people need to look afresh and say, this is still out there as a problem. What if Congress weren't there at the time of our greatest need? Norm, do you have anything to say about the lack of support ultimately for, you know, down the road for an amendment like the one we proposed?
You know, I think the biggest problem here is one of inertia. It's so easy just to say, because it hasn't happened, we really don't have to worry about it. More than the intense opposition to doing something. We got certainly opposition. We had members who were passionate about the need to have the House be a body where never, ever is anybody going to serve who wasn't first elected. That's not an adequate defense, but it was one that was adopted by some. And the intense opposition overcame what was a lack of passion to do something about this on the part of members. We need to have more champions inside who understand the gravity of this, the need to, in effect, create an insurance policy for the fundamentals of our political system. And we never did get, of course, votes that would have at least require the members directly to grapple with this, other than the small number who did in committees or with a few others who just took a strong interest in it. We thought, perhaps optimistically, that when COVID hit and it became a very real threat to the possibility of Congress meeting, this second crisis, that might be the trigger, that the first one wasn't. But it hasn't yet. And it's not clear to me how many passionate champions we'll have in the House and Senate. There are, of course, difficult questions to be raised here. It's easy to talk about how, well, we should just have emergency interim appointments. We need to figure out what the threshold is for when you trigger something like this. We need to really make sure that there are safeguards in place so that it's mischief making can't take place. I'm very confident that the work we did in our original commission and what we can do now can handle those. I'm confident that if we got a vote on a constitutional amendment to deal with this in the House and Senate, and leaders told their members, this is an important thing for us to do. It's not going to happen unless there is a catastrophe. And we got that amendment through the House and Senate, that we would get the states signing on and understanding that this is just to provide insurance to protect the system. But we've got a lot of work to do to get those members and leaders to focus on this and get on board.
Okay, we go to another question. Norm, you alluded to it, and this one is: how do you determine the threshold for when the amendment would go into effect? And subsequent, how do you basically safeguard against people taking advantage of it, or using some of these mechanisms for political purposes? And I think this is a good question, and it's good for the particular issue of the continuity of Congress, but it's also important to think about when we're thinking about this question of, is there some role for remote voting or proxy voting or some other way of Congress operating when they can't come together physically as much? There's always going to be a trigger and some institution that has the power to figure out whether we've met that threshold. I think the simplest way we laid it out in the past was to say, look, this is meant to be about an emergency. So we're not going to worry about the day-to-day issues that happen all the time, members leaving the House and dying, and even some minor incapacitations of a few members. Yes, that's a particular problem for the representation in the district, but it isn't a problem for the body functioning. We want to have the threshold be pretty high. But it is important to know that there's a way to have these provisions be such that they're not invoked in the day-to-day parliamentary warfare between the parties, that minority rights of the House and the Senate aren't protected. And so I think that's a difficult thing to deal with. We certainly believe at a relatively high threshold and didn't think that, on every day, a member who couldn't come in particularly, something would be dealt with for that case. But we do think dealing with it in a case of a more mass situation is important.
Exactly so. And the critical question here is there are a lot of different ways in which you can decide the threshold and have an objective body to indicate when that threshold is reached. But the most significant part of this is we want this to be only triggered in the event of a larger disaster that itself could imperil the very existence of a Congress for critical periods of time, or the representativeness and legitimacy of the body at a particular moment in time.
Okay, we have one last question. And of course, it's an easy one. I say that jokingly because it's about something that's been on people's minds. Is the Electoral Count Act a threat to the continuity of government given the confusion it engendered on January 6th? And this has been something we did deal with a little bit in the prior incarnation of the commission, something we will be dealing with coming up. I would say this: there are mechanisms, and not just the Electoral Count Act or different parts of the Electoral Count Act, that happen between when the people vote on election day and when a president takes office on January 20th. One of the most difficult questions is coming out of the 1876 election or other elections where there really is a kind of deadlock between the parties. Perhaps in 1876, as much as events recently were nothing to be wished for. 1876 was, far worse in the sense that states really did have almost rival governments appointing different slates of electors. Congress was deadlocked between the parties. The resolution of that, even with the mechanisms they put in place, went all the way up to Inauguration Day and were barely resolved. So I think the simple answer is yes, some of these issues matter. I do think they're difficult questions. I think some people today think, well, we could just rewrite an Electoral Count Act and make it really specific and take care of all of the cases. I'm not quite a believer in that, but I do think that there are things we could do to be much clearer. One point I think is important, and it doesn't matter where you stand on thinking about the election and the problems with the election and what your position is on that, but we should let the states resolve their elections. That statement is still a little vague, who's going to resolve it and how it gets resolved. But when they resolve their elections and they appoint their electors, and those electors show up in their state capitals in December and they vote whoever they're going to vote for, to the extent it's just one slate of electors, Congress is supposed to respect that view of the states. Now, that does not deal with the question of, well, what if a state is deeply divided or there's some other issues? Those are also very difficult questions. But I think a simple point is we shouldn't be relitigating the election after the presidential electors have cast their votes. They've been appointed, they've cast their votes. What Congress is there to do is to figure out, there are problems with those votes, not with the people's votes. And are we relitigating the election a long time? Plenty of time to have recounts, plenty of time to have disputes before that, but we shouldn't be having it afterwards. And a second issue I think people have raised, which I think is a fair point, is that Congress, the way that it may raise objections, and this happened, both the Democrats making objections in earlier elections and Republicans making objections in this last election. The threshold for making those objections is awfully low. It really is just one member of the House and one member of the Senate, all of a sudden bringing the House and the Senate into consideration of whether there are problems with a slate of electors. Ultimately, I think you have to have more of the bodies, both bodies, whatever that threshold is, but a more serious number of people saying, yeah, there are really problems we need to look into. And so I think those sort of issues are also important, but there are many, many others, and it is something I think that does impact continuity. Norm?
There's a report by the Task Force on Election Crises, of which I am a member, of a very strong bipartisan group put together by the organization Protect Democracy, looking at the Electoral Count Act. And I think it's very clear that it needs reform. There is bipartisan support for reforming it, to take away the power that theoretically exists that could enable somebody to try and strong-arm Congress or to cast doubt on the validity of elections, as John said. And there are specific steps that can be taken. That's a good place to start. There again, as with so many of these other issues, it becomes a question of whether there is the will inside Congress with leaders and others pushing reform to votes in the House and Senate. It's always easy to say, well, we have the budget that we have to do. We've got the reconciliation process we have to do. We have other top immediate priorities. That's still 3 years plus off. To fail to act, even when there's a clear need to do so. One would think that after January 6th, there would be more of an impetus, and I'm reasonably confident that we will see the appropriate attention paid to the flaws in the Electoral Count Act and move away from January 6th being anything more than effectively a ceremonial day.
Well, we're at the end of our program. It's been 20 years since 9/11. That day raised many, many questions about our institutions, our continuity of government, and whether those institutions would really be there for us after a terrible attack, tragedy, case of a pandemic. We want them to be there. And so again, these issues that we've been wrestling with and that we will continue to wrestle with are very important for the future of our country, for the future of our democracy, because something will happen. There will be another event, and being prepared for that event is important, because our institutions functioning as normally as possible are important in the aftermath. Thank you, Norm Ornstein, for all your work on this, and thank you for today. And with that, we'll close the program.
Thank you, John.